All right, ready to go? All right, that works. Okie dokie, let's talk reservation establishment. Oh. Huh? Oh, no, it's just the mask, because it causes it to itch. I even trimmed it. I don't know if you noticed. It's shorter than it was. This'll come next soon. I've hit my wall with the hair to a certain extent. And I think I have to go a lot longer to be able to donate it, so. Okie dokie. No, I was curious. I may have said before, the last time I had my hair long was right after I got out of, no, it was when I was in junior college, and I grew it about this long, and then I was working at a cement plant. And you want to know what's awful is getting cement dust in your hair, sweating, and then your hair essentially turns into concrete. Yeah. Yeah, that's the extra firm hold, as they say.
I'm giving haircuts now. I'm my husband's barber now.
Are you really?
Yeah.
How's Bob dealing with that?
He's good.
Good.
Getting to get out. He's just not
Yeah,
ready to come out yet.
yeah, I understand. Soon.
You know, I taught American Indians in 3rd and 4th grade.
Did you really?
But oh yeah, because that's what it was.
Yeah.
But I've learned so much the few times I've been here because we taught whole tribes.
Yep.
And it basically isn't that.
Yeah,
And
well,
and then of course when you get into when they started moving back over that way,
yes.
then it changed everything. So we taught basically the culture.
Which is really what it is. And to be fair, this is a false assumption that we Western Europeans have made in a lot of places, and frankly, it's led to a lot of the conflicts that we've been involved in too. I mean, for example, I was gonna, the Vietnam War isn't a great example. Matt could lecture more on this, but when we look upon a people and we assume just because they share, Afghanistan, that's a much better example. We look upon a people and we say, well, they have the same religion, which we don't, is a misunderstanding. They speak the same language, they look the same, they have similar practices, and we assume that they're all homogenous, right? That they'll all get along, which is one of the, now that we're looking back in a bit of a forensic, retrospect on the Afghani war. You're going, so many people now are saying, well, the problem is that these are a bunch of affiliated tribes, for lack of a better word, that have been at odds for a long time, and to treat them as a blanket people is, it's kind of racist, number one, but it's just because we come from our cultural history of nation building, right? And just even the concept of nationalism is a foreign concept that we project onto other cultures. Right? I'm reading a science fiction book right now. It's about first contact, and it's really kind of explores the difficulty of coming to understand someone else. And the more different you are, of course, the harder it is. But it's especially hard because what we human beings seek to do is we seek to find ourselves in the other person. And the less that we're able to find ourselves in the other person, what we do is we actually project more, right? Anthropomorphization is a good example of this. We seek to attribute human behaviors to animal behaviors when in reality we misunderstand the signals, right? For example, when you're working with dogs, making eye contact and showing teeth is something that makes canines nervous because it's a sign of aggression. But for human interaction, at least Western interaction, smiling and looking somebody in the eye is considered respect. But then, an interesting corollary there is if you go into a Southeast Asian culture, suddenly it's different. The bowing to the, anyways, I can go on and on about this. But with regards, and I did not, to be clear here, I only researched Pacific Northwest. I didn't do any research on the Plains Indians. So my education with regard to that is pretty much on par with what you learned. I suspect, though, based on the Vine Deloria Jr. book, that the tribal affiliation understanding is more appropriate in those circumstances relative to what it is with the Pacific Northwest. In other words, when we talk about the Chippewa or the Crow or any of the Midwest, Plains folks east of the Rockies, that's more of an appropriate understanding. This idea that there is umbrella governance, not governance, but what was the phrase that I used weeks ago? There's the shared socio-political.
Is that because they were nomadic and they had to roam?
Sure.
Whereas here, they were more pretty much.
They lived in their spot. It was very, very. It also has to do with the climate, right? We don't get snow in the Willamette Valley all that often. So you had people that, they're during fishing season, they were on the river. When the fish weren't running, they moved inland, but a little bit, right? It wasn't a long trek between the two. It was more than a day, but because it's just where they were living off Wapato and all these other things when the fish weren't running. But when you look, for example, at the Plains Indians that were following buffalo migration, the territory that covers is vastly different. But also, there may be cultural, sociopolitical differences. I don't know. That's where I'd love to talk to somebody who's a true expert in this stuff. But even the experts, right? That's what I talk about. Vine Deloria Jr., who wrote, I can't remember the title of the book now, but wrote the first book that I read. He was a Plains Indian expert, and he had zero understanding of the culture and context of the tribes of the Pacific Northwest, right? He assumed that it was just a bunch of, in some ways, the way that he talked about it, he almost treated them as like minor barbarians that lived up in these cold, wet climates, nothing like the great tribes of the plains, And of course, he had his mind changed.
Well, and I'm growing up in Montana, there was a common phrase people would use, we don't have a race problem.
Yeah.
And it was right on their doorstep.
Yeah.
Because the Indians and those reservations up there are in horrible straits.
And that's what we're going to talk about today. Assuming we get to that. I'm going to have to cut off by about 10 after because I'm doing Trevor's wedding this afternoon and it's way up on Mount Hood. So I need to get home, change, get a meal, and then drive up to Trillium Lake by 4 p.m. So,
Yikes.
I know I was shocked to see Cindy here today. I'm like, you're crazy. Yeah. Also pray for me because it's supposed to be snowing up there, which that's a longer story. All right. Okay, let's talk. Let's talk the events that lead to the creation of the reservation. And today, I'm going to focus specifically on the Grand Ronde tribes. We can later talk about the other tribes that I really coincidentally ended up studying this process a lot with were the Puget Sound tribes, specifically because the Vine Deloria book handled that narrative almost entirely. And one of the things that I've realized is that the experience was very, very similar, regardless of whether you were up in Washington or whether it was the Oregon, the Willamette Valley tribes or whatever, is that they all had a similar experience of the process of the creation of the reservations and then the consequences that followed after that. Because in reality, the creation of the reservations is just the beginning. That's the start of the troubles. You can, and we have talked about this, you can track the conflict starting in 1850, and it really culminates then in the termination Act in the 1950s is kind of the big resolution of that narrative arc. But to be fair, that was kind of the nail in the coffin. By the time we get the Termination Act, functionally speaking, the lands that the reservations covered had been diminished to a fraction of what they were. And what's been interesting, reading about the Grand Ronde Reservation is the tactics that were used were the same across the board. And the thing, because, and this was an intentional thing, because all the books that I read, with the exception of one, are written from the Native perspective. Obviously, there's a pretty strong, and even bias seems like a little bit of a wrong word there, but obviously there's a pretty strong emphasis on how destructive this was from the Native perspective. And by extension then, there, intentionally or unintentionally, there is attributed malice on behalf of federal and state governments and on behalf of even the Indian relation agencies, right? That, from the Native perspective, this was not an inconvenient consequence. This was an intentional process that was engaged in, of taking Indian lands, of trying to forcefully convert them to the white way of thinking and living. And so from the Native perspective, all the authors express just how destructive that was, not only for the culture and the language, but for the individuals that were subjected to it, right? So I'm just putting that out there, right? That the books that I read were from the Native perspective. We don't have the opportunity to talk to anybody that was involved on the federal side of things. They're all dead and gone. So I don't know what their motives were in this. But I suspect that it's kind of the same thing that always happens. Greed is thrown in there, and then just not wanting to deal with problems, which powers so much of bureaucracy, right? The brushing away of responsibility, which I don't know, Matt, have you experienced that at all working with the government? Yeah, never.
Well, there were whole groups of Indian people who were in Oregon that almost died out because, like, the Pit Indians were moved into areas they didn't even know how to live in.
And whole groups that functionally did die out. Well, let's get into it, because we'll get the picture. So, Joel Palmer is the superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1853. And he is the guy that proposes the concept of what becomes the Grand Ronde Reservation. And again, this is obviously, there's frustration built into these words. But it was considered that he picked the lands that become the Grand Ronde Reservation specifically because they had not yet been settled, specifically because they were seen as poor farming country, and because they were separated by the mountains, right? So the Grand Ronde Reservation is on the coast side of the coastal range, which means that the people living in Portland then have a mountain range that separates them from the natives, right? So these were the major decision factors in choosing where the Grand Ronde Reservation was supposed to go, which, if you then think about it, what are the decision factors that should have been there that weren't, right? Which is an interesting kind of path to trace. For example, we talked about it. Where do these peoples live already? What are the staples that they live on? The keystone species that are required, that they have used for their survival up to this point. What's the climate like? Based on where they live already, and how far are they going to need to travel to get to where this new location is, right? So the questions that were not asked were about sustainability, survivability, suitability of the environment that these folks are being placed in. It seems to be the main priorities in the decision making were purely with how it affected white folks in the government, right? And also, they didn't want to give away land that would be later seen as valuable. Now, here's the real stick, right? Is that in retrospect, they then later on realized the value of the land that they did give. Also, the scope of how much land that they gave, right? Which we'll get to in a little bit. So the process of the signing of the reservation treaty is interesting as well too. And I'm not going to get into total minute detail here, but the reservation treaties had to be established with each, and again, this is the difficulty of this, each tribe individually. And of course, the understanding of tribe was an understanding that was projected upon these people. In reality, what should have been done is each household, theoretically, should have been consulted regarding this. But instead what happened was that the Bureau of Indian Affairs essentially kind of like self-identified leaders of what they saw as tribes, which were merely cultural designations. And they picked out people and said, you're the spokesperson for this group of people. And what we come to kind of later figure out is that the people that were identified as the treaty signers did not in any way, shape, or form realize the scope of what they were signing to. I mean, not just the details of what the agreement meant, but even that they were understood to be representing beyond, their own little village, right? Which is really what was happening, was that the Bureau of Indian Affairs, essentially said that person is representing all these people, and that person thought they were only representing, these people, which later adds to the conflict and the confusion when the militia comes in, rounds up these people. And I misspoke. I thought that they had like 24 hours. They had minutes, right? So when the militia comes in, they say, you're leaving now. Whatever you can carry in your back, including your children, is what you get to bring with you. And then it's a 3-month journey in February from Table Rock to Spirit Mountain, right? So this was an issue with the treaty signing. The other, and this is true across the board of Native peoples in America in general, is that you've got and it's not just language. These are people that don't have a concept of land ownership, and we're trying to negotiate a treaty agreement with them where they're ceding land, C-E-D-E, right? Ceding land to the U.S. government, land that they don't really have a concept of owning, right? So regardless of what verbiage goes into the final treaty agreement, this is like negotiating, annuity payments with a 4th grader. I mean, and that's not me speaking or trying to belittle the intelligence of these Native peoples. It's merely that, maybe a better example is trying to negotiate annuity payments with me. I'm just using that word because it popped to the top of my head. I'm not even sure I know what it means, right? So, the point being is that, engaging in these agreements just culturally and contextually, unfeasible, whatever.
When you think of it, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I doubt there were any Native Americans on it.
No.
Well,
And
but that's what, see,
and this is fascinating as well too, is because you do actually get people in the Bureau of Indian Affairs that actually care about Indians. I mean, I don't want to paint that as, it was just a bunch of, but again, this is the issue of responsibility, is you're putting somebody in an untenable situation, right? You're saying in this case, Joel Palmer, the superintendent of Bureau of Indian Affairs for this region of the world, you're responsible with dealing with this problem, right? Which is just beyond the scope and probably the capabilities of a human being. And the fact that it's identified as not as a problem, and not as, trying to reconcile the situation, speaks to it as well too. So yeah, I mean, to be fair, and in the Puget Sound area especially, you could actually look at who was the responsible party, who was representing the Bureau of Indian Affairs at any given point in time, and see the effects of their leadership on what was happening. And a lot of it, especially in the Puget Sound area, had to do with the slow degradation of fishing rights, right? Whereas, if they had somebody that really did indeed care about the Native peoples, you would see them being represented fairly in court battles and represented fairly. And when you didn't, it was the total opposite, where they were almost actively working against the people there. And of course, because the Bureau of Indian Affairs superintendent was an appointed person that was coming from Washington a lot of the time, depending on who was in charge, who was in the White House or who was, in power at that point, you would get shifts in how the Bureau of Indian Affairs was actually, fulfilling that responsibility. So, no. Still works. So no shocker there. Sorry, I got off on a bit of a tangent. So the major groups of people that you get that then become part of the Confederated Tribes are, we already mentioned, the Kalapuyas, right? So the Kalapuyas, you can essentially break into three different groups. The Aftali, now known as the Tuolitans, the Malala, and, man, the third one I always think and forget. I should have written it down. Anyways, there's a third group. But then you get the Chinook. You get Chinookan peoples from along the coast, which we talked about last week. And then you even get people from farther abroad. And for the reason for this, I'm not entirely sure. None of the books I read explained it. But you actually get some Paiute folks that end up being settled on the Grand Ronde Reservation, where I thought that they all would have ended up at Warm Springs. And we even get some folks from the coastal waters down in southern Oregon, which there was a separate coastal reservation that was established down there as well too. And again, I don't know the exact details of why that happened, but to make a long story short, you end up getting about 41 individual cultural identities that get combined into the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde.
That's what they call it, the tribes.
Yes, but that understanding, this idea of the Confederated Tribes, is not developed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. That is something that when the people that get moved there establish their own governance, that's the identity that they claim, right? Because they're fighting against this assumption that all the people that got moved there are, culturally homogenous. They're trying to bring light to the fact that they are unique in their culture and their context, and they want to represent the diversity of all the people that are there. So the major event then is, and the other interesting piece too is that the final signers of the reservation treaty end up being the Tuolitans in 1854 and then the coastal tribes in 1855. What's fascinating is that the treaties with the Tuolitans and the coastal tribes never actually get ratified. So when the U.S. government, when the militia comes in and moves these folks north, the Tuolitans, the coastal tribes, don't actually have an honored agreement at this point, right? So, an interesting question to ask is why then do we jump the gun? Why do they decide to move these peoples in February, right, as opposed to waiting till August or whenever? And this is a question that isn't super well answered. We don't have a good historical reasoning. And so we're kind of left to speculate that it may have been malice, it may have been intentional, that they knew the consequences of what would happen, that somebody, a pencil pusher in Washington decided that this was going to be the date and it was going to happen by God, so that by the time they finish their term, they can point to their success in establishing the taking care of the Indian problem in the Pacific Northwest, right? All of these are valid reasonings behind it. But so 1855 is the end of it, and so February 23rd, 1856, U.S. military appear in these various villages that surround the Table Rock area, and they basically come and they say, "Hey, we're pack up your bags. You got a couple minutes. We're going north, and you've never been there before, but this is where you're going to be living the remainder of your days. So good luck." And it was 256 miles in February on foot, right? These are not horse peoples, right? So there's no beasts of burden that came on this journey, except that the military had. So I mean, here's the kicker: is you've got over 300 native peoples on foot. And mind you, this is just one example of migration, right? Obviously, people were being pulled from all over the place, but this is the most kind of like visceral, violent one. So you've got over 300 peoples that are on foot that are being escorted by U.S. military personnel that have canvas tents and horses and all this equipment. And meanwhile, you've got native peoples that are dying from exposure and hunger and just exhaustion, right? So the quote that it comes from Mr. Joel Palmer, that is just a gut punch to me, is he says, well, we lost eight people on the journey, but there were 8 babies born. So, essentially it all comes out in a wash. I started with 325 Indians, I arrived with 325 Indians, so I call this a success, right? Which is horribly callous, right? But voila. And I talk numbers, there were 325 natives, 106 cavalry members for those 325 natives. And then the cavalry members, horses, cattle, and all the things that they were brought with them. And the train of people stretched over a mile long, right? And you can imagine what that would have looked like, tramping through the coastal range in winter, with people strung out behind, watching stragglers fall behind as they're being led in these forced marches all day, watching old people drop in the snow, and how, just wonderful that must have been from a humanitarian perspective.
Is that what is known as the Trail of Tears?
Yeah, and so this is referred to as the Trail of Tears of the people of the Pacific Northwest, right? Obviously, the Trail of Tears that's most known in our culture is the Plains Indians experience. But and then the other piece that happens is that despite the fact that these people are being guided, shepherded, corralled by the U.S. military, you actually get vigilantes attacking the train at times. And so some of these deaths weren't just due to exposure, they were due to violence, of people taking retributive action for perceived slights, whatever the reason was, or just seeing people to exploit, is another good reason. So, I mean, to really summarize it, it's just awful. And so what we're looking at here, so just to kind of summarize all the peoples that get moved to the Grand Ronde Reservation, is you got the folks at Table Rock, right? And there's about 325 of those. You get some folks that are brought from the headwaters of the Yamhill Reservation. You get some folks that are from the Coast Reservation. And then you get some folks from the Siletz Reservation. And all of these folks end up being coagulated essentially into what becomes the Grand Ronde. So you got all these different villages, these gathering places where people were summoned together that gets moved. So that's how it happens. So let's talk about what life looks like for the people that are there. So imagine, if you will, having 41-ish cultures represented and then essentially thrown together into one place and said, here you go, good luck. You can imagine the chaos that ensues, especially because you've got different languages, number one, but just, imagine, I mean, it's like the United Nations if you just, threw a bunch of disparate countries together in a room and said, here you have a limited amount of food, you have basic shelter, and it's going to snow for another 2 months. Good luck. See how it comes out. One of the good things, and we talked about this last week, good is really relative here, is that they did have at least a shared language that could be spoken. So Chinook Wawa, which we talked about last week, was essentially the trader language that was spoken. And over the course of time, Chinook Wawa then kind of agglomerates aspects of some of the languages that people like. So modern Chinook Wawa is simultaneously has its origins in that trader language that was spoken 150 years ago, but also has incorporated aspects of the different languages that are represented on the Grand Ronde Reservation. So it's a little bit of a hybrid. But for the most part now, that is the native language that is taught to tribal members, so members of the Grand Ronde Confederated Tribes. They learn Chinook Wawa. Some of these tribes are at war with each other. So we talk about throwing peoples in conflict together. Imagine this is somebody that you've been fighting against all your life, and now you're supposed to get along and live together because you don't have another choice. And miraculously, the conflicts kind of seem to subside, because I guess the one thing that unites human beings is a common enemy. So they made it work. But I'm sure that you would be able to find stories of conflict that occurs in these places. Life was extremely hard. That goes probably without speaking, and kind of what we've been talking about is how hard it was. So aside from the cultural differences, the language differences, they were essentially put in a reservation with no governance. There was a bureau representative who was on site in their own nice building that was built for them with several military personnel that were there. But the purpose of the military personnel wasn't to provide support. It was merely to make sure that no one escaped, right? So if you tried to leave the boundaries of the reservation, you were ridden down and arrested and brought back forcibly onto the reservation. And of course, if you tried to escape multiple times, usually, you were killed while resisting, so to speak. Which is something we experience in our modern era as well, too. So for all intents and purposes, these were people that were imprisoned on a piece of land and forced to live together. With very few resources, no form of governance, and again, language issues. What is remarkable is how these folks eventually kind of come together to survive, right? So it's in this situation that I already mentioned. We end up getting the concept of the confederated tribes of the Grand Ronde, where these folks essentially, realize or decide that, this is what we got to do to make it. And there's nobody else that's going to look out for us. Because, again, the idea behind the reservation wasn't that it wasn't supposed to be that we now, create a new city of Indians that are under our control. It's we set aside a piece of territory where they can live peacefully on their own. Because remember, isolation was one of the purposes, the reasonings behind the location. We just didn't want to deal with them anymore. So you can imagine we didn't put a lot of energy into making sure that they were provided for and they knew what they were doing. Other issues that arise here are you've got people now living in individual houses, so there were structures that were built on the property. They weren't just thrown onto the ground. But even the nature of how they were asked to live was counter to their cultural experience. If you recall, especially in the Kalapuya people, you lived in family buildings. So you'd have as many as 5 to 15 families all living in a shared structure. Work was divvied up, then amongst all the people that were there. They were put into family unit buildings, essentially apartments that were very rudimentary, maybe had a heating system built into them and said, this family lives here, this family lives here, this family lives here. But that's not, that's not how they were. That's not how they were used to living, and so that was a hardship. What finally begins to happen as time goes on, and we can talk a little bit more about the process by which they come to self-governance and kind of learn to adapt with the situation. But as time goes on, what eventually begins to happen is you get kind of a loosening of a lot of the restrictions. So one of the things that folks realize is that trying to keep the Indians on this property without letting them leave is not only kind of an impossibility, but it's also kind of counterproductive, right? Because one of the intentions here was that we would eventually begin to convert these folks into a Western way of living. But if you've got them isolated and they can't work, they can't get a job, they can't support themselves, it's actually counterproductive to the end goal of assimilating native peoples into our culture. So they begin essentially relaxing many of the restrictions that were placed on them. They let people leave the reservation, take jobs, incorporate into the workforce. And what ends up happening is many of the native peoples end up incorporating into the lumber business. They get to be on land that looks familiar, and it's essentially unskilled labor, right? They don't need training for it. And they made okay money. Now, of course, as you probably expect, they were paid less than a white man would have been paid working for them. But you know what? If it fed their family and kept their tribe alive for another winter, that was good. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, then what you end up getting is that the tribe, the bureau representatives eventually just kind of lose track of people. They stop even tracking their movements altogether, and then eventually what you get is you get whole bands of people that just kind of go off the radar, right? They move away from the established boundaries, move away from the established villages. Some of them then kind of incorporate into life, near the city. Some of them kind of go off on their own, which eventually becomes a problem then when we start running into the reduction of reservation land, because they're like, nobody lives here, and then they discover a group of people that have moved onto that property, and then now all of a sudden you have to repossess it and deal with that. So final count is in the years immediately following the establishment of the Grand Ronde Reservation, you end up having about 1,200 people that are on that property. So 350-ish from Table Rock, but then with all these different disparate peoples combined, you end up having about 1,200. And that population, of course, grows, right, as people live and babies are born, but then also as people integrate into, move towards the Portland area or integrate into different towns and villages, you quote unquote lose people in that way. This has been one of the fascinating things in modern history as with the reestablishment of the reservations and people wanting to reclaim their native identity, this is fascinating watching them track how did my family leave the reservation, how my in a lot of cases it's people telling the story. My grandmother taught me native way, my grandmother taught me tribal ways, and her grandmother, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But how did they end up living in Portland, as opposed to living on the reservation? And the modern consequence is that, and I mentioned this last week, barely a fraction of Native peoples now actually live on the Grand Ronde Reservation. It's more of a resource center, right? It's become a resource center that it contains their culture, their language. It's the form of education by which they learn what it means to be descended from these Native peoples, as opposed to actually being the place where they live. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. Here's an interesting one as well too. So for example, we talk about people moving away. So in 1872, there was a report that came out of Oregon City that there was essentially an Indian quarter that had developed at Oregon City, which led to a lot of confusion because those Indians were supposed to be on the reservation, and ended up being quite an issue of trying to decide, do we just let them live here or do we try to bring them back to the reservation? And what ends up happening is that the agent in charge decides, well, what we're going to do is we're going to slowly, gradually, essentially kidnap these people and move them back onto the reservation, but didn't tell anybody about it. So the people that are living in the area who had come to know these Indians living in the Indian quarter are all of a sudden people are just missing, and they're like, are they dying? Is there a disease that's going through there? No, they were literally being forcefully, kidnapped essentially and taken back to Grand Ronde Reservation and saying, you're not supposed to live here with us. You're supposed to be over there. And of course, this isn't an isolated incident. We see this occurring. And then if they, in a lot of cases, if they didn't want to move back on the reservation, then you would get, NIMBYism, essentially where you would then get neighbors that would come in and kill cattle and burn down farms and houses and all kinds of stuff. So, what we see essentially is and it could be a chicken and egg thing, where whether it's the policy of our government towards the Native peoples then fuels fear, anger, and resentment amongst the population, or whether the fear, anger, and resentment amongst the population fuels the policy. It's, could be both and, but it is played out then in just the lives of people as well too, which it gets pretty ugly. It's 12:03. I got time. Let's pause. I've been fire hosing you here for the last 20 minutes or so. What do you think? What are your thoughts, feelings, or do you know anything that we haven't talked about?
Did you ever run across the Modoc Indians? In your region? Modoc?
No, I haven't.
That's well, they were southern Oregon, northern California, but they were moved to the north, and they just pretty much disappeared.
Do you know what reservation they were moved to?
Because I don't know that, because I only know the groups that we studied, because we didn't study it.
Sure.
I mean, the textbooks aren't necessarily, they don't go in depth at third and fourth grade, but in the same instance, I don't believe that was one of the things that was a contention with many of the people in Oregon that I've dealt with when I was on the state textbook commission, because the textbooks did not tell the story.
Yeah.
And, so, I never, I just didn't have enough background knowledge, but you just teach simple things that are important, just
Sure.
the idea.
Sure.
But I was just curious.
I mean, this is an issue that is coming to the forefront now, especially in the past few years, which is a rethinking about how we teach
Well, and
this,
then there's a group of people that don't want their children to feel guilty. So they don't want to tell the story.
Yeah, well, and that applies to so many things for us Americans, especially not just Native peoples, but with regard to slavery and all that. It's pretty hard to escape our history without at least shouldering a bit of a burden of guilt. Yeah, which that's a whole philosophical conversation as well too, which I would love to engage. But Susan, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I have over time seen charts that look at the golden rule,
Sure.
and that every major religion has a version
Yeah.
like that. I took a course in problems in intercultural communication, and the professor advocated the platinum rule, he called it, which is treat others as they would like to be treated.
Ooh.
Because we are just paternalistically
Yeah.
imposing what we're used to, whether it's Afghanistan or the tribes here.
That is a really great idea. That is fascinating. Because I mean, to be fair, that has fueled a lot of everything, right? I mean, if this question came up recently in talking about, what does it look like to do reparations with the black population? And one of the things that we have struggled with is that when it comes time to try and fix, and of course that's a fallacy in and of itself, to fix the mistakes that we've made, is that we want to fix things according to how we would want it to be fixed, without actually consulting or being in conversation with the people that we're fixing things for. Jim, you had.
This is kind of left field, I always try to relate my current interests and concerns to past history, but I often wonder how are we settling the homeless?
Yeah.
And we're doing good things. But
Yeah.
probably they were doing good things for the tribe.
Yeah.
And it's not connected, but I try to connect the dots and see.
Well, I think it is connected because, personally speaking, and again, this comes from, the last 5 years, I've spent a lot of time in working around and in this problem, and dealt with, and had conversations with all different types of folks with different perspectives. But it seems to me that one of the major reasons that we as Portlanders have been unable to make any headway with regards to the homeless population is that we're lying to ourselves. We say, and part of this has to do with, kind of the political climate in Portland. We say that so I was walking through Selwood yesterday, and 9 yards out of 10 have the sign up that says, I believe. You guys know what I'm talking about, which I have no issue with. I think that's, it's a beautiful idea. We say that we care about homeless people. But in reality, I think what our major motivation is we don't want the problem of homelessness to exist anymore, which is a starkly different thing than caring for homeless people. Right? Because if we don't want the problem to exist anymore, then we'll take any solution that means a reduction in the visibility of the problem, right? Which does not actually equate to a will to address it, especially when it comes to talking about, for example, a housing first model, which says the only way that you can even begin to start this, which is something that I advocate for, by the way, if that didn't come across, the only way that we can begin to address this is you provide a baseline of shelter and sustenance and care, And then you start addressing all of the other underlying issues, whether they exist or not, of mental health, addiction recovery, job training, right? But you can't even begin to address that until there's a unified will to provide basic housing for folks. And sorry, I didn't want to get too far down this, but the correlation for me is that as I've read through a lot of this, so much of the evil that comes out of so much of the evil that is done to the Native peoples in the United States of America comes out of not an actual antagonistic attitudes towards Native peoples, but merely because we collectively as society just don't want to deal with that problem, right? The whole concept behind the reservations is put them over there,
Out of sight, out of mind.
out of sight, out of mind. And once that's achieved, then the problem isn't visible anymore, right? We've done it. We've given them what they wanted, right? They get their piece of land. Never mind that it's not a land that's sustainable. Never mind that's not where they used to live, and never mind that we haven't actually, helped them learn how to live in this place that we've dropped them into. But there you go.
Well, and most of the conversation that goes on is like, why are they there, as if it's
Yeah.
a blame game.
Yeah.
Rather than they are there, let's help them, and then figure out to keep others from getting in the same place for whatever reason.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah, and to be really transparent as well too with the issue of homelessness in Portland especially, a lot of where we get stuck is in talking about the how, right? How it's supposed to happen, So where is it okay to put shelters? Where is it okay to have tent encampments? And you might have noticed that the city released 8 proposed locations, and half of them are already canceled. I'm like, I could have told you that right off the bat. Like, who's coming up with these ideas?
They didn't even visit.
No, it's like, oh man. But for me, again, this comes back to the same idea: is that we as a city just don't have the will to actually follow through on the problem and care for these people. We just, we'll take whatever out of sight, out of mind, right? Because I bet you, sorry, this is going way off reservation here, which is probably not an appropriate idiom, but which is evidenced by the fact that I guarantee you that these neighborhoods that were proposed sites for homeless villages probably had people that voted in favor of all the different funding proposals that would have created these. But when it came time, when they found out that it was going to be in their neighborhood, how many folks flipped? And I'm not necessarily demonizing them. I'm just pointing out, it's such an easy thing to talk about when it's over there, but when it's in front of you, it's a totally different thing.
You have a wedding to go to.
Thank you, Paula. Let me just wrap up. So we actually left off at a pretty good place, even though I started to wander off on tangents. Next week, we will talk about the actual process of becoming Grand Ronde Indians. So I alluded to the process by which they kind of unify and begin to take self-governance in hand. We'll talk about what that looks like because it's beautiful. It's absolutely fascinating the way that they kind of take what's given to them and say, all right, let's make it work, right? We don't have another choice. So, all right, that'll be next week. We'll do.